want to begin by thanking everyone for joining us here today, and also especially to welcome Dr. Sarah Stein, Dr. Omar Baum from UCLA, to talk to us about their fantastic book, Wartime North Africa. Wartime North Africa won the AJL Judaica Reference Award for the year 2023, which recognizes books published in 2022 for their work, Wartime North Africa. I will say it was a unanimous decision by the committee to recognize this book as the recipient of its reference award. And it was not at all an inside job, as discussed before this recording officially started. The book is the first ever collection of primary documents on North African history and the Holocaust. It gives voice to the diversity of those involved: Muslims, Christians, and Jews, women, men, and children, Black, brown, and white, the unknown and the notable, locals, refugees, the displaced, and the interned, soldiers, officers, bureaucrats, volunteer fighters, and the forcibly recruited. At times, their calls are lofty, full of spiritual lamentation and political outrage. At others, they are humble, yearning for medicine, a cigarette, or a pair of shoes. Now, I want to acknowledge especially the many languages that are represented in the book, because I think that was one of the things that truly wowed the committee. And when we talk about how a reference work is put together and the types of materials that we're looking for, we thought about the fact that there are documents from French, from Arabic, from North African Judeo-Arabic, from Spanish, Hebrew, Moroccan, Yiddish, things that were transcribed also from English, but that there are many of these texts that would be otherwise inaccessible to a lot of scholars who work primarily in the field of English and to students of the field. So it is a truly remarkable accomplishment. And I want to thank you both for the work that you did and for bringing these sources to light. And I'm delighted that you're here to share with us some more about how this came together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sure, I'd be happy to start. Well, Eitan, thank you for that introduction. I think we're both really so proud to receive this award. Thank you. And to say what I think is on all of our minds all the time, it is a time of such suffering in the world and such violence and pain. And Omar and I think I can speak for both of us, are believers in the importance of books, of learning, of education, of collaboration, of friendship. And this volume in some ways really arose from these deeply held suppositions. And I think we'll talk about that. So Eitan, in the email of welcome to this event, you had suggested something that we've never done before, and we decided to follow your suggestion. We both have given a lot of talks about the book, but we've never just had a conversation about its origins, about what drove us to write it, about some of our goals and maybe favorite parts of the book. And so we thought we would do that today without any fancy visuals or any prescribed text.
Okay, but I am known for terrible suggestions, so just
didn't seem like one to us. I also want to say thank you to so many friends, colleagues who are here. Omar, do you want to add anything by way of introduction?
Yeah, thank you, Eitan, for the invitation, and thanks for everybody here for being here. It's really an honor to get this prize, and as an acknowledgement, not only of the labor and the work we've done on this book, but also of the collaboration. I think it's also, this is a book that acknowledges and celebrates the support as well as the collaboration of many people around the world, and we'll talk about that. And as Sarah mentioned, this is a book that, as many of the books that I did with Sarah and other friends around the world, as single authored or co-authored, this is a book for me that in times of, we're thinking these days in times of the pain that Sarah mentioned, it's a book that we hope that it pushes people to listen to each other. It pushes people to talk to each other. It pushes people to feel empathy and towards each other. And it pushes it. So in this month of fasting, as the month of Ramadan is ending for me and for many other Muslims out there, we pray for peace and for strong Jewish-Muslim relations, strong relationship between Judaism and Islam and Christianity. And we'll start, Sarah.
Okay, let's start. Well, we set ourselves the task of talking about a few things. How this project came about, whose voices we wanted to include, how we went about the gathering, the translation, and we wanted to read a few voices from the book very briefly, and speak about the nature of the collaboration and what we hope to offer readers and especially classrooms. Maybe I left something out, Omar, but we'll find our way there. So, Omar, maybe I will ask you, when you think back to the genesis of this project, Wartime North Africa, what was important in your mind? What work did it serve to do that you felt was instrumental?
So first of all, let me start by, oh, you put me on the spot here.
Mm-hmm.
So let me start by saying that just like all amazing, great, and sometimes challenging ideas, they always come from Sarah Stein. And I remember she invited me to give a talk in one of her seminars about my book, Memories of Absence. And as we were talking to the students, it was really informally, but also naturally, just came out. Sarah said, wow, we've never done this before. I think we have a source book that talks about Sephardic experiences that she did with Julia, and then said, I think it's time to do a project like this. And that's where the idea came from. It really came in a graduate seminar where a question from a student raised the absence of a source. And I think that's the inception of the whole project. And it was beautiful to see it there, to see it coming out in a conversation between faculty and students. So just to answer your question, I think for me, and I think this is where I see eye to eye with Sarah as far as how many of these projects are done, is to think globally. The voices coming out from different directions of the world, but also meeting at one space, which happens to be North Africa, was an important way for us to think about it. And then when you say these voices with different experiences, then came language, came social background, experience, occupation, and so on and so forth.
And I would add to that maybe with a few words to contextualize for anyone who's not had the chance to hold it in their hands, the book tries, and as Eitan said in his introduction, the book tries to bring together a range of sources that speak to the experience of a wide array of peoples who lived through the Second World War in North Africa, including local Muslims, local Jews, European refugees who were Jewish and Christian and other categories, people who had been volunteers for the French Foreign Legion or the Spanish Republican Army in the course of the Spanish Civil War, and who eventually got deported to North Africa, people who lived through forced labor and internment camps, including Muslim anti-colonialists who were swept up by the three occupying regimes who have a presence in North Africa during the war. Really four, but the French Vichy regime, the German Nazi regime, and the Italian fascist regime. And extraordinarily, these kinds of people and more are not only all experiencing the same global events in unique individual fashion, but they're also intersecting sometimes in the same physical spaces, including places like internment or labor camps. So I think the other thing that comes to mind when we sort of chat about the origin story of this book is to say that to the extent that these people's histories have been looked at before, which honestly is fairly minimal, but to the extent that they have, they've been looked at as existing in discrete camps, communitarian camps. How did Muslims experience this period? How did Jews? How did refugees? And it really struck us that these people had shared and overlapping experiences, and to bring their voices together. The other categories that I didn't mention, but that are crucial to our thinking are boys and men who are forcibly inducted into the French army. Either they are Moroccan or they are so-called colonial soldiers, many of whom were from West Africa, and are compelled to serve under the French flag in many spaces of war, but including in North Africa. So that idea of bringing together a story of anti-Semitism, of a refugee crisis, of anti-Blackness, of anti-Muslimness, of Islamophobia, all of which are inherited from a colonial era, but come together and interweave in the course of the Second World War, caught up in a larger story of racist persecution and anti-Semitism, to us was to kind of honor the story's connection to one another.
So can I add, so in addition to all of these things that we tried to do, what we didn't want to do is to talk about the diplomats and bureaucracy and all of these basically state institutions. So we knew that that's all there, but we want to do is to show it through the experiences of these ordinary men. So it's literally a book. It's literally a project or a book of people without history to some extent. And so I want to ask Sarah a question that has to do with, once the idea was set up and germinated and came up, now can you say a little bit about the process and who is involved in doing the research for this project?
Sure. Well, Omar, I feel like we had so many conversations over so many media for so long, in person, WhatsApp texts while one of us was traveling, phone calls, because what we set out to do, I feel, is to kind of create a canon where none existed. And so I think that this process involved a lot of brainstorming on our part. What kinds of voices would we like? How are we going to find the voices of girls? How are we going to find the voices of women? How are we going to find the voices of the poor? How are we going to find the voices of young Black soldiers from, West Africa serving in a Vichy camp in the Sahara? But each time we had one idea, we would think of something else that was missing. And even when we had a whole kind of cast of ideas, there was always the question of how to find them, how to find these voices. And we did a lot of digging through a lot of archival collections, many of which, to the great gift of archivists and librarians that we've worked with around the world, were able to share with us. So we did a lot of digging, but we also needed help. as all scholars do, we needed help. And we enlisted the help of some brilliant graduate students who knew languages, new collections, new materials. We enlisted the help of members of these communities, descendants of the people involved, of our colleagues in North Africa and in the United States and in Israel and beyond. And slowly began to amass a body of possibilities, and kept culling and adding and removing and supplementing and reinventing. So I think it was a kind of wonderful, messy trial and error that was a real pleasure, Omar, to work with you, but also hinged on our reliance on friends and colleagues and students around the world. And some of these documents exist in such disparate places as, in Morocco, in Mexico City, in England, in France, and in archives, all places in between. So it really was a kind of a great puzzle to piece together.
I want to follow up with the point there, because I think one of the things I really enjoyed working with you on this project is and the graduate students here at UCLA is when we got to the process of selecting different sets of sources, of possible sources, and then we get to this conversation about which one is the best fit to where and then I think one of the beauties of how those selections were done is really, it's not only whether the source is a good source, or is an exciting source, but is it a teachable source? And I think that was how to turn the archive or the material into an object or into a theme of teaching that will show to students something, and that will connect the dots across the Mediterranean, between Africa and Europe, and across the world.
I wonder if we can sort of intersperse in our conversation a little bit of reading, because the sources document this process, I think, in some beautiful ways. And for those who've joined us, Omar and I kind of challenge each other to each choose a few, and we'll just read very short passages, sources that bring to life this project and the range of voices, and each raises their own question of selection and translation and annotation. We haven't yet talked about annotation, but I'd love to speak about that process of framing and editing and footnoting, since we have the company of people who care about those issues as much as we do. So Omar, maybe you want to read a little bit.
So I'm gonna read. I'm gonna start with a number 16, famine in the anti-Atlas Mountains. Not that because I'm biased towards where I come from, but Sarah and I, we used a lot of material that came out from one individual. His name is Ghaddari, and he recently passed away. So in reading this, I'm also trying to remember him, and we're trying to remember him as somebody who kept the memories of some of these histories alive through his oral history. So this is a story of among many stories in southern Morocco, in southeastern Morocco, where many camps, a few camps were set up by the French, by the Vichy government. It's a camp actually that called Bouazer, which is a cobalt mine, around the cobalt mine, that was used by the French before Vichy took over. But the Germans had their eye on this camp, going back actually to 1912, before even World War I. And then later on, when Germany occupied France, the German consulate in Casablanca, one of the things they were interested in is how to go back and then extract the cobalt from this camp, from this mine, because it was one of the most important mines, and it's still today one of the most important cobalt mines in the world. So Ghaddari writes, or at least tells, because again, this is a story that we had a number of data from Ghaddari, but because we needed something specific about the camp, so Sarah and I, we reached out to my nephew, who is a teacher in the village, and he went to Ghaddari and he interviewed him about this particular story. So we have about 5 or 6 pages in Darija, in Moroccan dialect, mixed sometimes with some words in Tamazight, in Berber, and this is what we were able to get from this. The year of hunger, otherwise known as the year of rations, killed so many people and destroyed so many communities in our region. A combination of war, typhus, drought, and famine was like a wildfire that struck the southern hinterland. Palm trees did not yield that many dates. And the few that did grow were confiscated by tribal lords and distributed between the Pasha of Marrakesh el-Glawi and the French colonial administrators. News circulated that Hitler stole the food of France to feed the German population, forcing France to take native North African food shares. Each family was given a ration of food, including just a few grams of wheat and a small portion of sugar and cooking oil. Not all families were benefactors, even of this. Rural areas like ours were so even on the list for distribution. Families trekked the mountains of Bani looking for hedgehogs, spiny other lizards, and wild desert animals. I remember people were so hungry that they had to eat their own donkey and their source of farming. We couldn't follow the Islamic rules anymore. Many were forced to eat dogs and cats to survive. As the food shortage grew, people started looking for edible grass, especially as the slow supply of American wheat did little to stop hunger. As if that were not enough, typhus struck communities, killing hundreds of families. Clothes were rare. People walked barefoot. Stories circulated that people waited for families to bury their dead and then dug up their tombs to take out the shrouds and use them to cover themselves. Others turned burlap barley bags into garment. The mining companies continued to enlist hungry and weak workers from the villages in its mines in the Anti-Atlas. Many local villagers were forced to work in the cobalt mine of Bouazer, which was located a few miles from Fumsgid. Others were enlisted to clear roads between Ouarzazate and Marrakesh. Sarah, which one would you read?
Well, I'll read a different kind of
for you
source.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to add that after the book was published, Omar was able to visit the man whose testimony we published with a copy of the book. And he was very proud to see his story and his photograph in print. So that was a wonderful thing. And part of the power of that testimony comes from the fact that there has been no effort to systematically gather the testimony of Muslims or Jews who experienced wartime North Africa, or indeed Christian refugees. And some of those Jews and Muslims who actually were directly swept up in into the Nazi death machinery, the death camp machinery, also have not had their stories systematically gathered, which shows a really horrible dark spot in the vision of certain major Holocaust collecting institutions. Although the tide is changing, but alas, possibly too late. I identified a different kind of voice, one that speaks to the imposition of anti-Semitic and race laws in North Africa. What Omar just read, the testimony from Al-Gadiri, talks about state engineered famine and state engineered spoliation of the landscape of North Africa. And of course, at the same time, running parallel to this, we have the state engineering of the execution of anti-Semitic and racist laws in North Africa as in Europe, including the theft of property and businesses and assets, and including pushing Jews out of professions and certain rights, deprivation of citizenship when they had it before the war. So one of the first places where this happens is in Italian fascist occupied Libya. This is one of the first places where race laws and anti-Semitic laws are implemented. And to give a feeling for what that was like to experience, Omar and I combed through the quite vast collection of the Alliance Israélite Universelle their archive, which is an educational and philanthropic organization that opens schools for girls and boys across the Mediterranean, dating back from the late 19th century. And one of these schools was in Tripoli, where there was, in 1939, a competition or an essay assignment where the students were asked, who were teenagers, to meditate on what it meant to be Jewish. So I'm reading from source 6, an essay written March 6, 1939 by a teenager named Maria Bravanel, who answered that question of what her Jewish identity means. And I'm just going to read a paragraph. In the past, I rarely thought about the fact that I'm Jewish. Reminders would come to me in the course of our holiday festivities, and I considered myself a being just like the others, blessed with the common capacities of man, sensitive to the pains and joys that are part of life, with the only difference being the religion of my ancestors. I must have fooled myself. To this day, belonging to this faith is a problem. Recent events have refuted my former convictions and have aroused in me sorrows that only a Jew is called upon to feel. I am Jewish. Consequently, in the eyes of some, I am marked by the stamp of shame, unworthy of fulfilling any function in society or of nourishing any lofty aspirations. By dint of repeatedly hearing these affronts, I have ended up feeling uncomfortable everywhere, in the street, at shows, all these eyes that look at me. Do they not reproach me for crimes? Do they not seem to banish me from the room? Do they not condemn everything about me, down to the way I dress, the way I sit? I feel as if I must no longer go out, as if I must hide at home to examine my thoughts and behaviors. What faults have I committed? Because I am less privileged than others, my exam comes to only one conclusion: I am Jewish. And that's the end of the section I'll read, but I'll say that these racist and anti-Semitic laws will severely upend Jewish lives across North Africa, and will also find realization in not only legal and economic suffering, but the physical suffering of those, mostly men, but also some women who are sent to forced labor. And sometimes, although this was not really the intent of the labor camps, sometimes also to labor camps. So let me say, we have a chat here for those who are present. You can feel free to pop in a couple questions. We can, maybe we have a couple more sources we thought we might read, but maybe we'll take a pause in reading to reflect on the process of translation,
Yes.
Omar,
Yes.
and editing and annotating. Yeah.
And if you could also add in a little bit more about the process of discovery and the different stories that came in. I mean, Omar, I was really struck by how much you tracked, how all the work involved to track down the person, your nephew, was it your nephew you spoke to? And just how this process of assembling this collection and the personal work that entailed.
Yeah, and so I think one of the really gifts, I think, as far as my friendship and also my academic relationship with Sarah is about, is really when we talk over the phone or a meeting, we're talking about a topic or a source. We always go in different directions, and those directions really take us to the people we know and the sources and the libraries we know. So everything started literally with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's archive to some extent, I would say. And so Sarah did her readings, I did my readings, and then we started to make links. And then when we see that there is an absence, then we go to another level. So I remember we were talking one time about, Sarah said, well, there's nothing, we don't have a lot of representation of women here. So we need to do some of this. So we get to look at sources where the potential places we could find things. So we had to go to Nelly Ben Attar's archive. And then if Nelly Ben Attar's archives doesn't have the resources we think that they were in terms of teaching, again, because that's really something that we kept stressing, is that how teachable a source can be. Is it too abstract for a reader or for readers or not? So, and if it's not, so what can we, if there are elements that are not too abstract, how we can cut it down and then make sure that the story makes sense to an undergraduate students, a graduate students, or even the general public. So all of these things were really, that's how we went about. So I remember also just about the race, we were close to finishing the book, and then we start talking about West Africans. So and then we couldn't find a lot in the archives, but I have to go and ask archivists in Morocco. We reached out to some scholars in Senegal who work on similar topics. They gave us leads, and then from there we were able to find material about Senghor. And I think, but then once we found the material, then you have to figure out whether you can use it or not, and who owns the rights of the document. That's also another really difficult these are all different processes. One text of one paragraph you can spend sometimes between the translation, figuring out exactly whether you can use it or not, to the editing. It took a lot, but generally it's a group project.
Yeah, and Omar, you mentioned Senghor. So this is Leopold Senghor, who was the first, who was a anti-colonial theorist and writer, forced into military service for France as a young man, spends time in a Nazi prisoner of war camp where he's arrested for serving the French. After the war, will go on to be the first president of independent Senegal, and whose story perhaps one could imagine from the outset that it would be unexpectedly related to Holocaust history, but it ends up being intricately related to histories of race and racism and anti-Semitism and violence in and through North Africa. So Eitan, another way to think about the answer to your question, which is sort of interesting, is that because testimonies and histories of this part of the world have not been gathered as assiduously as other corners of the Jewish world, a lot remains in family hands, and this was a remarkable discovery for us. The same is true of the Judeo-Spanish Sephardic heartland. So it was really instrumental for us to reach out to descendants and find materials in private archives around the world. And these have scattered with the families themselves, these papers. And that was really only the beginning, because a source is just a collection of words unless you understand its story. And to understand its story, we needed to understand the author, the other people featured, the journey of the document itself, the journey of the family in cases. These sources, it was mentioned that we work in a lot of languages, which we do, but they are also internally multilingual in really interesting ways. And so getting help, especially with local expressions or dialect or personages, entailed us also to go on a kind of fact-finding mission with the help of our context as well.
I think I want to ask you, Sarah, if you can talk a little bit about the translation. But before we do that, I want to acknowledge the help of many members of the community here, Jewish community here in LA, who helped with many of the at least some words sometimes that I didn't understand, or we didn't understand, so we had to go back, and then we sought their help, not only here in the United States, but also in Morocco, in Israel. And even I want to talk also about if you can say something, Sarah, about the translation and the photographs.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, yes. So indeed, there are a lot of language represented in this volume. Many of which, between the two of us, we have reading facility with, but not all of which we feel fully fluent in. So we developed a system of translation where we would read every source that we could. Every source would have at least two people checking its translation against the original, so that it didn't rest in the hands of just one translator alone. Went through many drafts of editing. The book is diverse in genre: poetry, memoirs, letters, diaries, photographs. I'll get to that in a moment. Petitions, pamphlets, each requiring a different sleight of translation hand, I would say. Just to offer two very different examples, I can think of a letter written by a woman in a Vichy camp who was begging a philanthropy for a donation to help her child through a sickness. And she was writing in a language that was not her language, and she probably was little formally educated. So how to translate in a way that honored the nature of that speech rather than sanitizing it was something we thought a lot about. And then in a very different case, there is a very gripping poem that we both really love, I think, that plays with the abbreviation SA to refer to the paramilitary Nazi organization, and makes repeated puns with that begin SA, and how to translate that from French into English to maintain the SA, but to still make it sensical, just represents an entirely different struggle of translation and annotation. So the photographs, we both love working with visual sources and with photographs. And that too was a kind of Alice in Wonderland journey through archives, family collections, our own collections, books, many institutional collections across Europe, across North Africa, Israel, the United States, and beyond, to find images that I think our interest throughout was not only on a gripping visual image that told a rich story rather than just simply being a historical frame, but which elevated a human experience of war, whether it was the threat of sexual violence or the kind of complex religious, interethnic, interracial encounters that unfolded in camps in North Africa. Photographs that brought a human scale to the story, along with text that brought a human scale to the story, was really paramount to us. So that too had a whole, experience of searching, of selection, of culling, and of trying to also caption. And I think captions are such a delicate art. You have just such a small space to communicate the complexity of an image, and something that we also thought a great deal about.
Can I add something about the photos and photographs? I think for me, probably, and I think probably Sarah would agree with this too, is one of the most difficult thing that we encountered in this absence, or at least some lack of documents, that I think the French colonial administrators and prison guards and camp guards did this on purpose. And then they talk about it, the archives mention this, is that the erasure. And when the Americans came and the Russians came and opened and led the prisoners from the camps in Europe, they had the cameras with them. They were able to document that. We don't have a lot of that in North Africa. So it's really difficult to find some of these photographs. And I have to acknowledge the work that Sarah did, and this as far as Mexico, and there are photographs in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's archives, but not a lot. So, and I think this is where a lot of the work has to be done, because matching the memory and the vignette and the story that gets collected from somebody whose story has never been told, and trying to put it and then to have a visual, an image close to it, just to support it. I think we need more of that. And I think doesn't mean that there are no photographs out there. There are. I think you just have to look for them, and to again go and look for family archives and personal archives, and we might. I know that some of my colleagues in Senegal are trying to work on some of these, especially given the fact that there were 6 camps in West Africa where the French definitely documented some of these, and that's where potentially they might be somewhere in Senegal, or they might be somewhere in France. But that's the work I think we hope a future generation of scholars and researchers would do.
I know our time is beginning to wane, and I thought it might be nice to just introduce 2 more voices. One that I chose and one that Omar chose, and we haven't really spoken that much in the course of this conversation about the European refugees and the imprisoned in labor camps. So I wanted to read some words by a poet who published under the name Aub, whose whole name was Max Aub Morenwitz, who was the child of a French Jewish mother and a German Christian father, lived mostly in Spain, volunteers for the left-leaning Spanish Republican Army in the course of the Civil War. And when Franco defeats the Republican Army in Spain, Aub, along with many of his colleagues, including a huge thousands of international volunteers for the Spanish Republican Army, flees to France for safety, is in France when when Germany occupies France, the Vichy regime is created, and there the Vichy regime will arrest those who are considered undesirable foreigners, and those who are left-leaning, who are political enemies. And so Aub, along with many of his colleagues, will be deported to a Vichy-controlled camp in North Africa. And he writes a lot in the camp and after the camp, including a collection of poetry, 47 poems. And he talks about reading these aloud by night to the other inmates in the camp, as he describes them, quote, hungry and livid. But this is a poem I'll read a little bit of called God, So Many Dogs, written probably in 1942. God, so many dogs, the commander and his dog, the assistant and his dog, the sergeant with his dog. God, so many dogs. There goes the commander with the horn-handled whip. How well the light red color complements the man's brown skin. There goes the assistant up to his neck in wine, the two holding on to each other. And behind goes the sergeant. God, so many dogs. Tell me, who is more of a dog, the drunk or the teetotaler? Where milk is enough, the other is missing wine's dryness. One strikes the liver, the other through the wineskin. Tell me, between gentlemen, the strikebreaker or the master, who is more of a dog? The one that hits or the one that licks boots, blind with fear? Who is more of a dog, the master or the servant? And I'll stop, but he continues on with this dramatic, angry parody of power and of violence that he witnesses in the camp. So these are, Aub, for me, in the context of this conversation, represents many voices in this book of refugees, of those who objected to the rise of fascism and were punished for their political beliefs, and who lived out the course of the war under forced labor and in dreadful conditions in the Vichy, Nazi, and Italian fascist run internment and labor and concentration camps in North Africa and the Sahara. Omar, do you want to?
I wanna read something. I told you I'm gonna read a text that Les Risques, but I've decided to read something different because I want to talk about the beginning, the idea that North African Jews didn't know that the danger of the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazism. I think that's a when you look at some of these texts that we were able to collect and the songs that they show something different. And this is a text that it's the beginning of the book, 1934. It's about a description of a text about Purim written by a teacher from the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And actually, I was talking to Sarah when the book came out. I met a Moroccan Jew in Rabat. He's a very important figure in the community, and I showed him the book, and then I told him the name, and he said, "That's my uncle." So it's really just to see how personal and how these stories are actually very still means a lot to people, and I think we're helping at least raise awareness and consciousness about these histories. So the book, the text is translated from French, called Hitler as Haman. January-March 1934, Hitler in our midst. It is quite curious to notice the state of mind that Hitler's rise to the throne of cruelty has created in our average Jew. The name of the champion of collective and official crime is on everyone's lip. Everything that could be linked to Hitler's Germany, to misfortune, to anything or anyone that might cause material or moral harm takes the name of Hitler, the man of the 20th century. Even children know his name and its unfortunate reputation. The time of Purim was, but is no longer, the celebration of Haman's downfall. We hope that it is also the celebration of the imminent downfall of his successor. In the evening on Purim, in the temple, you could hear cursed be Hitler more often than cursed be Haman, which amounts to the same thing for that matter. In the streets, you often hear the Hebrew expression, may his name be wiped out. They're all talking about Adolf. A person is defined by his maliciousness, he's a Hitler, and so on and so forth. So this is what this text, I think, for us, what it means is that it opens up the conversation. It opens up the whole conversation that people knew, people were aware of the danger. And we're talking here about the city of Meknes, which is probably one of the most important Jewish communities at the time in Morocco. It's where many of the rabbinical schools, one of the most important rabbinical schools in North Africa, that trained rabbis from Algeria, from Tunisia, from even as far as Syria, and even some parts of Turkey, of modern Turkey today. It highlights what this text highlights. It's an opening to all the things that the rest of the other documents talk about.
So I think we have 3 great questions in the chat if you're open to answering them. I'll read the first, which is from Zachary Baker. Have any of these previously hidden family and personal archives made their way to public repositories, either original documents and photographs or digitized versions of them?
A good question. So some gathering has begun. Thank goodness it has, but it's begun too late, honestly, but at least it's begun by Yad Vashem, by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, to gather family materials that document the experience of these families. But notwithstanding those efforts, which I'm grateful for and I do admire, I would say notwithstanding those efforts, in general, we could say no, there hasn't been a systematic sweep for these materials. Omar, would you agree?
Yes. Yes.
And so mostly they remain in personal hands without a duplicate being made public. There are some interesting cases where families themselves have put things online, or in one case I can think of if I'm not mistaken, a master's student who wrote about her grandmother's experience in Libya. I might be getting the generation wrong, but I think it was her grandmother's experience being deported from Libya to a constant Italian fascist camp in Italy. But mostly these remain neglected by the major organizing collections that have as their mission to preserve Second World War materials. There are efforts in North Africa, especially Morocco. There are efforts in Israel. There are efforts in the United States, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Yes, it seemed very pointed.
Yeah, I'll add something, Ethan, to this question, this really important question. I think one of the where I think a lot of work needs to be done is in Spain. I think probably Spanish Republicans were able to collect a lot of stuff, but it's some people in Algeria, descendant of Spanish Republicans who stayed in Algeria, or mostly in Algeria, some also stayed in Morocco, or they went back to Spain. They had a collection, and I think that's where we're really struggling to figure out, especially the photographs and some documents. But apart from that, I think mostly families keep documents to themselves. And the reason why I'm saying this, because Sarah and I, after the book was published, we got a lot of emails from people all over the world. Some of them are professors at Harvard. Some of them are I can name people from New York who are descendants of some of these people who went through these camps. And they talk about that we have a photograph here, we have a document here, and some of these documents are copies that we can find actually at Yad Vashem and other collections in Israel and the United States or France, but some of them are also still personal. And I think that's where I think the work needs to be done to really help us understand a lot of the things that we think, Sarah and I think we were able to figure out. But later on, once the book is published, and then we're doing more readings, we figure out, oh, we messed up this. We need to do more work on this. We need to add more to this. And that's the archivist. That's really the job that librarians, archivists are doing. And that's with more material, we'll be able to add more to how we understand this phase or this period of the war.
Well, it sounds like there's room for a collaborative multi-institution project here in order to figure out how to do that collection. And I started to say, I couldn't help but hearing a little bit of a pointed jab at some of the testimony collecting projects that they've neglected this particular area in trying to think about how the experience of the Holocaust. So I'll read the next question, and which is from my colleague Pauline Lewis, and I believe a former research assistant of Sarah's. So thank you so much for this great conversation. I'm curious how Sarah and Omar navigated some of the challenges posed by the pandemic for researching and creating this book.
Well, this was a strange project that actually, I think, one can't say this for many aspects of life, but actually was sort of suited to the timing of the project paired decently with the crisis of pandemic, because we had already, by the time the pandemic began, we had already done most of our collecting and had amassed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of documents just on our hard drives. And so we spent those months reading and discussing and translating and working with our wonderful complex team of translators remotely, meeting outside to go through tables of contents and refine and reimagine. And also perhaps one could say working on a project that is composed of many parts allows you to use the different parts of your brain that pandemic maybe speaks to, because one could do smaller bits of work at a time on a single source and really burrow into a single voice rather than being confronted with the challenge, say, of writing a whole book. So we were ironically a bit blessed by the timing of the crisis, not in other ways, but.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah. And I think there is, just to add one point here, sometimes when we feel that we didn't have a document, even during the times of COVID, we had to rely. We have a lot of friends all over the world who were able to help and share with us what they own in their own personal collection. So
if we have time for one more, I think I would like to read the last one, which is, could you please speak about how your work addresses the correlation between the languages of colonialism and anti-Semitism, and if you're in conversation with scholars of German studies?
That's wonderful. Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we meditate over a lot in the book, and are in close dialogue with scholars of German studies and of Holocaust studies, and of memory studies to think about this. But one of the ambitions of the book is to think in new ways about the geography of the Holocaust and the chronology of the Holocaust and the typologies of the Holocaust through the lens of North Africa. And what I mean by that is to say, how do we come up with a timeline that suits the North African story? How do we expand the understanding of the racial violence that unfolded within the context of fascism in Europe? How do we understand that in the context of North Africa, and by extension also West Africa, and even sub-Saharan Africa? So very much, I would say, we are in dialogue with colleagues in these fields, and we hope that we are contributing to pushing at the edges, chronological, typological, and geographic, of Holocaust studies as it has been imagined before.
Yeah.
Omar, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
No, I would, with all what I think you said everything perfectly, Sarah, here, and I would just add that if you think about the anti-Jewish laws, the first iteration of them and the second iteration, right after the German occupation of France, and then 6 months or 3 months or 2 months after that, you have forced labor and the opening of the camps. That says everything. So, and then you start thinking about those laws and those anti-Semitic laws and anti-Jewish and the racial laws in conversation with what the Germans were already doing through their own officers in Casablanca, in Marrakesh, and throughout other parts of the French colonies. That's, I think, there is a huge connection just in terms of the legal framework. Then when we get to how it's applied, then I think that's where we're definitely in conversation with scholars in German studies and other and Holocaust studies in general.
I want to thank you both for sharing your time. Wherever this idea came from of the two of you being in conversation, I think it worked out wonderfully. It was such an illuminating, thoughtful program that I think we all learned so much from. And it really was an honor to read this book, to be able to grant it the award, and then to hear you talk to each other about how the book came to be and the process of making it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're so grateful.
We miss you.
It's great to see you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.